Welcome to the Remembering a Life podcast. I'm your host, Holly Ignatowski. Today we're talking with Dr. Sara Murphy, a death educator, certified thanatologist, and suicidologist, about the incredible toll mass shootings and other mass fatality events are having on each of us personally and collectively as a nation. We're speaking with Dr. Murphy after the mass shootings at Tops Friendly Markets in Buffalo, New York, and at Robb Elementary School in Uvalde, Texas. These horrific events are still top of mind for many of us as we try to move forward in our individual and collective grief. Thank you, Sara, for joining me today.
Thank you for having me, Holly.
I wish we didn't have to talk about this, Sara, but we do have to talk about this. Mass shootings are occurring more frequently than ever before. It's been a horrific year. And when they happen, the grief runs throughout the entire country, much like 9/11. We think of how, but for the grace of God go I. This could have been my loved one. This could have been my child. What is unique about this kind of grief and how we process it both as individuals and collectively as a nation?
That's a great question, Holly, and it's certainly a challenging one. I, too, wish we didn't have to talk about this. I think all of us are processing the trauma from these situations in a very unique way. So to answer the question, I'd first just remind everyone that grief responses are always going to be unique to each individual. They're always going to be different. What happens when these type of mass casualty public events happen is that there's a dissemination of waves of trauma. And there's a sense also that the events that are happening are so incredibly unjust, so undeserved, so overwhelming that we might not even really know how to begin to process that loss itself. And of course, when these events also happen, whether they're in the schools or whether they're in other public spaces, it's a challenge to what we call our assumptive world. And one of the key forces in our assumptive world in American culture is that we have freedom of movement, that we can be in public spaces and assume our own safety, that we can send our children to school and know that they're going to come home at the end of the day. And when these events happen, it poses a huge threat to, and sometimes even a shattering of the assumptive world for us. Something that I think we all need to think about in terms of challenges to processing our grief is also our unique positionality. And you're right, these events will, cause a ripple tide of grief throughout the country, but the grief that we experience is also going to be filtered through our position, whether that's our geographic position and more proximity toward where an event occurs, or our position either as a parent or an educator or someone who works in a venue very similar to where these things also occur. And so consideration needs to be given to that as well. There's also challenges to processing grief based on the saturation of media coverage and what position or angle or narrative media is striving to make after these events occur. And also, of course, the frequency of mass shootings and public mass death events can also disrupt processing. When these events are occurring in such proximity temporally to one another, we might not really be able to process one before we're hit with another, which means that our grief can take on a level of helplessness in thinking, well, there's nothing I can do to control either my grief process, or certainly there's nothing I can do to control when another one of these events may happen, and also a degree of hopelessness in thinking that this is just the norm now, and that we can't individually maybe sense that we can affect any kind of positive change. So the processing of grief is really unique, especially because, by and large, most people who feel affected by these events are not actually people who know the people who have died or survivors themselves. So, in addition to grieving an unjust loss of life, we're also grieving our own sense of security, our own sense of safety, and feeling like we are protected and safe within our communities as well. So I would say all of that combined and collectively contributes to a very unique type of traumatic grief response.
Let's talk about that helpless feeling. So when this happens, these mass fatalities, whether they happen in our own state or 6 states away, how do we channel that grief? Sometimes it's anger. How do we channel that in a way that helps us to move forward in those feelings?
I think far too frequently we see unhelpful or unhealthy channelings of that kind of anger. I think it's important for everyone to remember that anger is part of grief, and it's a very common part of grief in terms of the wide spectrum of emotional responses to loss. I certainly have to grapple with my own anger when these events occur, and I personally channel that anger into education and into advocacy. I think it's not uncommon to feel anger not only on the perpetrators of these acts of mass violence, but at the culture and the systems that allow this kind of mass fatality normality to continue. So something I would encourage people to do individually is to try to think about and assess how that anger is being channeled and whether or not it is helpful or harmful to them, to their families, to their community, to our culture, and whether or not it's personally healthy or unhealthy. I think there's a lot of social media warriors who come to the fore after these events who maybe are thinking that, the tactics that they are taking are cathartic and helpful, but they may not be helpful to people who are primary survivors. So whether it's something like advocating for change or directly supporting those who are primarily grieving or opening dialogue, whether with children or with family members about those feelings of anger, I think that there are definitely healthier ways to grapple with anger than simply, further divisiveness or finger pointing.
And if that loss happens on that more personal level, so now that we've experienced this, for instance, with parents, a parent's number one job is to protect their child. And losing a child is just unnatural. It's not supposed to happen. So how does a parent even begin to process or put one foot in front of the other when they not only lose a child, but lose a child in such a violent manner?
I would encourage anyone who has lost either a child or any loved one in one of these mass fatality events to seek professional help, to not think that this is something that you're going to be able to work through on your own or even just as a family system. And I would be seeking out professional support from trained counselors and therapists who are also experts in trauma and in traumatology. And something else that I know has been helpful for parents of previous school shooting losses is to reach out to one another. That there is, as in the case for different kinds of unique and traumatic loss, there's a shorthand between survivors because of that inside experience and a shorthand in really being able to discuss the complex feelings that they're going through of grief and the lifelong nature of that grief and an acceptance of the lifelong nature of that grief, that people who, say, even lost a child to cancer are not going to have access to that same set of experiences in losing your child in that particular way. And for these events that don't happen in school systems but are happening in the public, similarly, I would say, being able to join a support group or start a self-help group or even more colloquially just get together with other survivors and just be in a space together and be able to emotionally ventilate might be able to start the process of coming to terms with the fact of the loss itself. And then with professional support and mental health support, the grief work individually is something that they'll be able to undertake.
And I imagine that's very important when you think about not only the people who were involved in, say, a public supermarket shooting or the children who survived these mass shootings when they have to go back to the grocery store. These kids have to go back to school. Or even a child who, again, is 6 states away and says, Mom, am I going to, is something going to happen to me at school? How do they find the courage to do those normal, everyday activities again?
That's a great question, and I don't know that I can answer that. I don't know. I don't know how people find the courage to go back to their daily lives after an event like this has happened, because it is so outside the norm, and it is something that no one should ever have to go through. I do appreciate, and we're seeing it more recently, and we're certainly seeing it in Texas, that there's no longer an expectation for children to go back to the same school. I think that's really important, because I think at that age developmentally, the nature of that re-traumatization would just be unbelievably hard to try to grapple with. But yeah, there is an expectation that survivors do still have to go on with their daily lives somehow. And I think with peer support, in addition to familial support and professional mental health support, they can start to accumulate the tools to be able to do that. But it's not going to be easy, and it may never be easy. These are events that should never take place, and they're taking place with great commonality, which means that the number of survivors of these types of events is just growing from year to year. We had some respite during the pandemic, the height of the pandemic, in having this massive drop in public mass shootings. And now here we are in 2022, and they're just exploding all over again. So we have a lot of survivors, and we have survivors still who are grappling with events like Columbine in 1999, when I think we just publicly started to see that this was something that could happen. And all of those people are deserving of all kinds of support in just trying to get through their daily lives.
Grieving is so difficult. It's really hard work. And especially when we're grieving on a regular basis, that can be just emotionally exhausting. Sara, are we at risk as a nation of becoming maybe numb to these kinds of tragedies, or on the other end of the spectrum, being paralyzed and afraid to live our lives in an effort to protect ourselves?
Yes, we are at risk of both, and I think both are happening almost in a cycle for many of us individually. I can't speak to the numbness of the nation, excepting perhaps, the numbness to really find a way to make sure these stop happening, these events just stop happening. But as individuals, I think that numbness is something that can be a way for our mind to protect ourselves temporarily from becoming overwhelmed. I hear about this sort of cycle from my students with such frequency that there really is something to the idea that we are vacillating between possible numbness, possible paralysis. I teach courses actually on mass death here at the University of Rhode Island, and we have a unit on public shootings and school shootings in which students are also writing essays about what it's like to grow up in a culture of school shootings. And, I don't think that people are looking to the daily experiences of high school students, middle school students, college students who, unlike me or you, have grown up in a culture where this was already on their radar, where they're doing active shooter drills in schools regularly, where they're seeing this on the news, where, they know where these events are occurring and they have the shorthand of reference to them. And I think that we can't really prevent the numbness. I do think it's a way of our mind protecting ourselves, that it's a normal temporary response to incredibly abnormal situations and events. But I think the paralysis piece can become very disruptive to our daily lives. I mean, I work with students who have explicitly said that every single time they enter a room with people they don't know, they're checking for the exits in case someone brings in a gun, who don't go to the movies anymore because they're scared of being in the dark in a group of strangers and not sure if they could get out if someone started shooting. And these are all things that they've had to learn and adapt to while their brains are still developing. So they're processing very differently than adults do. But even for those of us who are, middle age or older, I think that there is a risk of interference with our daily lives, in which case we need to seek help and have open dialogues with friends, with family, with peers, with people who can give us space to talk about it, whether they're feelings of anxiety, whether they are, triggers of being in particular kind of places after a shooting has happened in one of these types of places. I think it's also important to, be informed, certainly, and to bear witness to survivors of these events, but also to take a break from news coverage and to take a break from the endless cycling loop that, could suck us in 24 hours a day if we let it, because we want to know everything about these events. We want to hear the theories. We want to try to make sense of them. But that also can run the risk of taking over our sensibility and our ability to sleep healthily or eat healthily or, feel a measure of security even in our own homes. And that kind of paralysis can definitely have negative effects on our physical and mental health and well-being.
Sara, what if we we personally know someone who lost an immediate family member or a close friend in one of these mass fatality events? How can we support them in the long and short term? I know we often leave food on the porch, but is there more we can do? Is there something appropriate that we can say to them or do for them?
Yeah, I think as in any kind of loss experience, we need to follow the lead of the griever. We need to make sure that the person who is grieving is at the center of the conversations and that we are not, appropriating or imposing ourselves upon them. I think something also to bear in mind is that the person who has lost someone, whether it is a child or a spouse or a sibling or a friend, they're grieving that child or spouse or sibling or friend. They aren't just a statistic who died in a mass fatality event. And while that person, that survivor, is going to need to grapple with and work through and grieve the way in which their loved one died, they also need to grieve the life that that person lived and what they brought to them. So just as in any other case of grieving, I would encourage people who want to be supportive of the people they care about to offer specific ways of support, right? I say this really frequently, but to get off the script, to get off the "I'm so sorry for your loss, let me know if there's anything I can do to help" social scripts, but instead to say, "I don't know how best to help you, but I really want to. Would it be helpful if I cooked dinner for you this week? Would it be helpful if I came over so you could just talk about what's going on? Would it be helpful if I picked up the kids from school this week?" And when you offer people who are grieving options, you're giving them a tiny sense of empowerment in a situation where they're feeling often completely disempowered. And in events that are so traumatic and in losses that are so traumatic, it's really important also that we make sure that the griever has space to ventilate emotionally and to talk about anything they need to talk about, which is often going to be circuitous and where thoughts may be running in all kinds of different directions and may not even have a through the line that we can understand. And to be able to listen to them without judgment and simply validate everything that they're saying, everything they're feeling in the unique and often overwhelming spectrum of grief responses. And something I would also caution here that primary grievers often experience after one of these events is a disenfranchisement of their grief. And, between media coverage, public response, social media, and this American desire to create a narrative to make easy sense of a complex tragedy and to find someone to point a finger at and blame. In the midst of that, individual grief can get lost, and individual stories of loss can become appropriated to fit into a narrative. And survivors, much like military loss survivors, can feel both put under a spotlight and yet at the same time individually unseen in terms of the stories being told about their loved one versus the person they knew. So if we know someone who is a survivor from one of these events and who is grieving, remembering that their loved one is not a media story, is not one more person in the X number who was killed at this event, but was someone who had an entire life behind them and a future in front of them that was robbed. And that survivors need to be able to talk about their loved one and not just the event that happened.
Listening and validating is so important. They're very simple things that we can do, but they're so important when someone is going through a loss. We often tend to talk about, oh, I've been through that, I know what you're going through, but we don't. We don't know what, my loss is different from your loss. And so just by listening to people, that does make such a big difference. And in that same vein, how do we remember and honor the lives of the people who actually did die in these mass fatality events? Whether we do so as individuals, to a friend, or as a community.
Yeah, I think it's really important, and this sort of goes along with support when we do know someone who is a survivor. I think it's important not to appropriate the dead and not to tell stories that do not necessarily have bearing on grieving themselves. I think it's important to learn about victims, and I think it's important to share our grief individually or collectively as communities when these events occur. But I think it's also important to check ourselves and make sure that we are not romanticizing these events in a way in which we are taking a life and pretending that we really knew it or understood it. But I do think it's important to remember and honor the lives of those who die when we don't know them. And, one way to do that is visibility, to come together as a community and memorialize, hold memorials, whether within houses of worship or secularly in the public, out in the open, in parks, etc., where we can talk about not only our grief for the people who are survivors, who have lost their loved ones, but we can talk about what this grief means for ourselves and our own community. I also think it's really important to say the names of the victims instead of the names of the perpetrators. I think it's important that we give space to and we honor the dead by saying their names and not focusing as much of our public attention on the people who are perpetrating this violence versus those who have died. And along with that, to learn their stories, to learn from survivors, whether they choose to be, in a media spotlight or not. And I think maybe the best way that we can honor these lives is to be vocal about a need for change, that we need to go beyond, as we've said in recent years, the script of thoughts and prayers, because if we want these events to stop, we need to take part as, citizens in making sure that these events stop happening in our own communities. I think that's a really great way to honor the dead.
Is there anything else you'd like to share with us today, Sara, about these awful events, kind of a comfort to get us through them?
I'm striving to be comforting, and as an educator myself, I am never unaware when I walk into a classroom that we are living in a country where these events happen and that no community can really feel completely secure in them. What I would say in terms of thinking about how to navigate a future in which we're all hoping that these events stop happening is that we do have a responsibility to bear witness to these losses, because doing so means that we need to reckon with the worst within our own humanity, but that we also have an opportunity and an obligation to contribute to change, whether it is memorialization, whether it is supporting those who are survivors, or whether it is something like advocacy or legislative reform or activism, that we are not in fact helpless and that we do have a lot of good in our communities and a lot of good in our country that no longer wants to reckon with these events. And I think in coming together and having open and non-divisive dialogues, in honoring the dead, in honoring the survivors, and in working toward a better future in our country, we might be able to hold on to hope that the next generation of children will no longer have to contend with these events.
Sara, thank you so much for joining us today to talk about this very important topic. Your words and your guidance do bring us comfort.
Thank you so much, Holly.
For more information about remembering loved ones, visit rememberingalife.com.